Welcome back, everybody, to the Joys of Solo Travel podcast show. Today, I'm extremely excited to have someone I've known for many years. She is such a positive soul. I would call her a superwoman. She manages incredible things, and she's also had an incredible amount of travel experiences across around 30 countries around the world. So today, we have the very wonderful Eve from Canada. How are you, Eve?
I'm doing so well. Thank you for having me, David. I am incredibly excited about this.
It's my pleasure. And I know you had such an eventful day of wellness and such a group. Tell me about that. What do you usually do in some of these events on Sundays?
Yeah, so on Sundays, my co-founder and I, we host Sunday Resets, which is a weekly hour of meditation, yoga, and journaling. So Liv and I came together, of course, for our entrepreneurial journey, but we realized there was kind of a gap in communities that are kind of focused on wellness and mindfulness on Sunday mornings. And whether you go out or not on the Saturday, or you're going to brunch or not on the Sunday, we thought that there's this need for like a space that's very intentional where people could connect and really get to know one another, share vulnerably and openly, and practice wellness. So yeah, that's what we do on Sundays. It's called Sunday Resets, and it's open to anyone and everyone in Toronto.
That is fantastic. And even on the topic of wellness, right? Because you talk about intention, you talk about energy a lot, and something I know that you really stand by. And that translates a lot to the way you travel and the way you connect with locals and the people and the culture. So actually tell me about that bridge, right? Your values of how you view the world and how you view the universe. How does that translate to you when you're actually traveling by yourself or in a group of people?
Yeah, when I travel, I'm always seeking a way to connect with the very folks who are most connected to the space, the culture. And I think from a long time ago, there was this distinguishing of being a tourist and being a traveler. And so I've always sought to be a traveler. Why? Because I feel like you just have a richer experience. It's like, it's one thing to, at the surface level, do the destinations, maybe the landmarks. And yes, that's important, but like, how can you actually go in greater depth? A lot of the time it's through actually connecting to the very people who spend their days there and who maybe have the hidden history, or have experiences they can share from actually living there. So I definitely make an effort to do, whether it's tours that are led by locals, or to go into the lesser known places, but ones that are like indicative of what the experience is like for the people living in places. I'm sure we'll get more into it. But yeah, I think connecting to a place and history you can really do through the very people who live there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how you distinguish it in two terms, traveler versus tourist, right? And I know, and even this is a great segue into your experience in Colombia, right? For example, where you actually lived in Colombia. And I believe you didn't speak Spanish at that point when you moved there. Or did you speak some basic Spanish?
A little bit, I understand it. My godfather is he's Spanish speaking, and so I grew up with it here and there. And speaking French and Polish helps, but it was really when I got there that I started taking lessons, and I continued for a year onwards. I have to say, immersion is the best way to learn. And so when I'm not in it, obviously I lose it. But I have to say about Colombia, one thing is language, yes, helping, of course, decrease that barrier. But I have to say, the folks in Colombia were just so open. I'd never experienced that like in any other place, where they were so willing and wanting to invite people into their culture and understand, whether it's through dance or their architecture or whatever it is. Like, I think there's just I don't know, just very special kinds of locals in Colombia, specifically speaking of Medellin.
Hmm. And speaking of that, right? Like, and it's always the people that make the place and like just the energy that you feel and how you feel connected to that place. And everybody's different, right? Some people might feel very connected to one place and the other feels connected to the other place. I guess for you, let's say when you were in Colombia, when you moved there, you mentioned to me that you were actually learning Spanish through dancing. Like, how did that come about? Is it just because you were integrating a lot with the locals and a lot of these interactions?
Yeah, so looking back, there was with taking dance lessons, but also taking Spanish lessons. But funny enough, our dance teacher was also a Spanish teacher. And so, ingrained, when he was missing words, expressing, how to do certain dance moves in English, he would obviously say them in Spanish. So there was definitely that blend. And you can imagine it's really still very much a work in progress, but how to put it, I guess them not being necessarily, they're not fluent necessarily in English, and I have, very broken Spanish. So we'd have to complement with Spanglish, if you will, in dance situations, in going out in the bars, in, touring museums or whatnot. So that's how it came about.
Interesting. And actually, this is a really interesting topic because it's like, what are the advices you would give to somebody that would go to a place they don't know the language, where they know very basic, I guess, words of that language? What is the easiest and the best way to actually start building a foundation to be able to communicate? Is it to start with the grammar? Is it to just go inside and just, integrate and communicate with the locals? Like, is there a very efficient way for them to really get up to speed to be able to learn that language?
It's a good question. I think that the best way is to either find a school or a teacher or even a peer that's willing to entertain the basic conversations, because that's where you're going to start off and that's where you're going to build off of. So if you can immediately get into whether it's like peer groups, or my Spanish teacher, for example, was one who, would always just ask me about my day, ask me about what I cared about. We would have real life conversations. It wasn't super structured. And I think there's a few, there's different methodologies to learning a language, but I've at least found that kind of the most natural, but also the most helpful, and not, having to go through like the grammar rules or whatnot. And why is that? It's because when I'm talking to the Uber driver in, wherever it was in Colombia, um, the grammar doesn't matter that much. It's more about trying to understand one another. And so if you've had these, conversations, whether with teachers or peers, you will get some of the enough language, enough of the terminology, I should say vocabulary, to be able to get to somewhere in the conversation. So yeah, I would worry about the grammar. That's an iteration, that's a perfectionism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I realized one thing also just through traveling is that humans are humans no matter where you are, right? And a lot of times maybe you don't even speak the same language, but you're able to almost somehow still communicate with each other, whether it's just through hand gestures or just through the energy that you're projecting towards the other person. And you can kind of almost feel that dynamic. Did you feel that a little bit through your travels and as well?
For sure. I think that I think that kind of going back to like the whole even like Spanglish thing is, whether it was through, or even, integrating French in some instances, right? Like you have to become very resourceful, right? Sometimes you don't have internet in a certain location, so you can't bring up the translation, but it's through gestures. It's in dance, it's literally through movement, right? It's like there's sometimes you don't have to say how to do a move, you just show how to do it, which is a really cool thing as well, communicating through dance. I think also just like going back to the theme of immersion, but also like what's the best way to learn. I think that there's ways you can also quote unquote like simulate an immersion, and like changing the language on your phone to Spanish. I've done that before. Or, even when you're looking around, like noticing all the signs. Or I had a friend who once gave me advice around like put stickies on things in of objects around you and name them in that language. And so I've actually done that before, but I haven't done it too much. I think just being observant, though, in terms of how would I call this? How would I call that? And trying to entertain it. So any way you can kind of create a simulation is great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you mentioned about kind of the expressiveness of the Colombian people and the people there. I'd be curious. It's obviously dance is such a big part of their culture, of their lifestyle. How did you feel? How did dance, and people and culture and lifestyle, how do these things merge together when you were in Colombia?
Oh my goodness, the dance scene and specifically Medellin is wild. It's really a very unique. and special experience to be a part of. So maybe for a bit of context, I can even share the teacher, Alex, who was, showing us the basics of bachata and salsa, introduced us to what I would call like felt like an underground scene in terms of the dance clubs we'd go to be like underneath some highway where it looks like there's a shed, but this shed at night opens up and suddenly you have a dance floor and it becomes a bar. Like during the day, you think nothing of it. Again, it's like beneath a highway ramp or something of the sort. And at night, it comes alive. It's incredible to see. And in terms of like, how does it all blend together, lifestyle and culturally speaking, I think for me, I remember this distinct moment of standing at the bar, looking out into all these, beautiful people picking up one song, dancing with one another, giving each other a hug, moving on to the next dance partner, next song, and this fluidity of pouring themselves entirely into the dance, the music, and being. And I had this moment of, that Colombia, it's there's a lot of turmoil. There's a lot of political instability and there's a lot of challenge and hardship. And at the same time, like that's a reality, but the reality you also see is folks also wholeheartedly pouring themselves into this type of expression. And I think, speaking as even seeing our dance teacher kind of speak to this, it's both his realities, is like the passion for whether it's politics or, creating a better life or whatever it may be, but also, you know, being so present in the movement, in the music, in connection with, the dance partner that you're partnered with for a given song. And so I think that was really inspiring, is like the kind of wholeheartedness of both, and like the passion also in this example, like the duality of, I guess you could say, like the day to day and what is happening like in Colombia and for folks, but then also, in the evening, how folks also let themselves enjoy and make the most of life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really do view dance as almost like a form of expression, right? Just like, people who can sing or play music. And I'm always envious of that because it's like you're able to express your emotions in certain ways. And I guess in this case, it's with that partner living in that moment with the music in that backdrop. And I guess the feelings you might feel, it's
Yeah.
incredible.
And I want to ask you, David, because you are an awesome dancer. Folks are going to
I
know
wouldn't say
now.
that.
How did you get into, I guess, you know, traveling and, oh, sorry, we know travel, but traveling, dancing along your travels? Like, I don't know, how did you learn it? Have you gotten to experience more dance within the places that you visited? I'm curious.
I think for me, it's just, it's all about just integrating with the people and the culture, within that specific place. And I try to go to places that's a lot more local. So I don't really plan my trips. I'm just, I just book one plane ticket. I'm there and being spontaneous and just attracting the right energies in my life along the way. And a lot of times when you're so integrated in that specific culture, there will be things that come out of it, right? For example, in South Africa, they have certain types of South African dance, which is just so incredible, right? And if you go to Latin America, it's a completely whole set of rhythm, of beats, of music, and of the way that your body will move. And like I said, just like when I view people who are like that, and it's just so mesmerizing to see that they're when they're dancing, they don't care about anything else around them. They're not worried about what somebody else thinks of them and so on. So if you're able to now then yourself put yourself in that situation and say, well, I don't care if what other people think of me, and I'm just enjoying my time in that moment and just trying to let your body flow as much as you can through that. You're able to just pick up things here and there. And everywhere you go, it's very different. The rhythm, the beats, and everything. So I've definitely never had any formal training, so I wouldn't consider myself a good dancer at all. But I would say that I'm not shy about trying it and about just having fun and just expressing. And I think that's really the beauty of then connecting with
Yeah.
others.
And how beautiful is it when like the locals invite you into, literally pull you onto the dance floor and teach you the ways. Like I just love that.
Absolutely. Actually, you just reminded me of a story, and then I want to get back to a question I had for you regarding Colombia. But I was in Morocco and I was in the Sahara Desert. And I mean, it was absolutely beautiful, by the way, Eve. It's the crystal clear skies to see the stars. And I was sleeping in a tent in the Sahara Desert. It was a Marzuka Desert, and with the Berbers as well as I had some local Moroccans there as well from Marrakesh. And then we were playing drums by the fire, and everybody was dancing a lot more traditional local dance. And that was just that moment just gives you a lot of chills. Like those are the moments that you remember. Everybody is so happy from all different parts of the world, and we had the locals there, and we're doing a lot of these, traditional things. And that's the really those moments are really the things that's really beautiful about these experiences. So
Wow.
I did have a question for you, Eve, is in Colombia, right? Like what is it about Colombia that made you stay that long and that really became such a memorable part of your entire travel journey? Like what is it that really resonated with you about Colombia? I know we talked about the people a little bit, the
Yeah.
culture a little bit, but is there anything else that really attracted you to really, feel the energy there?
Yeah, I think there's a real vibrance there. And I say this with, sensitivity to, a couple decades ago, it was one of the most dangerous regions in all of Latin America. And so, of course, there's a very dark and tragic history, and there's still a lot of challenges. Specifically, I think about like Medellin's history. And I think you know, I don't know if like despite that, or rather like even through that, there is vibrance in the beautiful murals. So Medellin is known to have some of the most incredible art and colorful art on buildings and in the streets wherever you go. Similarly, the actual city has, these crevices of rainforest and birds. It has, very biodiverse. Colombia in general, like the incredible range of of birds specifically. And so there's a lot of color. There's a lot of, I would say, yeah, I use the word vibrance because you see it in even how, for example, Medellin city is, but then also in the people. And so I've heard this, that even the way that every city has a bit of a different kind of Spanish accent, if you will. And so apparently the folks in Medellin have more of like it's a very lovely, like song-like, fluid-like accent. And so there's this kind of like vibrance that comes in the ebbs and flows of their voices. And yeah, this is really a run-on in the ands of the vibrance. But I think that there is definitely through whether it's the art, the people, the the dancing, and even the sounds. Like I think there's a lot of incredible Colombian artists, and the, you know, I think that there's definitely the scene of expression is really big, and you feel that like you're there, and you kind of you get bought into it, you get integrated into it, and I think you feel a lot. At the same time, I have to say, like what pulled me to Colombia too, apart from say this vibrance, is also it's a very I found like easy, city to move around in. Of course, there's, a lot of parts that you want to be very careful in or avoid, in fact. But whether it was, getting around easily through the Uber or the overground metro, or being able to take a sort of gondola in terms of, up from one end of the city to the other, because it's, really the landscape is very hilly. Actually, it's more like valley, and so to get around it can be challenging. But it's now the infrastructure is really good. I think also at the time when I was there were 4 WeWorks in Medellin, which I think is a really good measure of like how either open a place is to, having had like digital nomads, how good the internet was great. So it's all these sort of things that made it really easy to, in my instance, I was working remotely. And so it made it easy to do that, without interruption, but then also indulge in everything, all the vibrance that the city and the country had to offer. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
It does, it does. And it's fascinating you mentioned that. And actually, one thing I read a lot about Colombia is Comuna 13. Were you able to go there?
Yes, I did. So I went on a guided tour by one of the locals and incredible specific, borough in Colombia that had, lots and lots of violence in the past. And I believe still there's a lot of hardship, poverty, and challenge. But what's interesting is it's a place where there are guided tours, and of course, as very in a specific part of it. But from what I know, I don't believe that there's many other, using the term sensitively, like favelas, where you can actually visit as a tourist and be okay. And it's interesting how the locals have, almost designated this as like a, implied safe zone because it, of course, brings funds. They have their shops, they have souvenirs, they can sell all this sort of thing, and restaurants, in fact, in of course, this designated spot out of all of Comuna Tres. Um, yeah, it's something very special, and to be very up close to some of the sites where there was, really, devastating incidences, and there's, a sort of hill where there were many bodies buried, some time ago because of all this violence, and it's jarring. But I think, again, with sensitivity, like I think there's a lot of hope as well in terms of, how folks acknowledge the history, but there's also a sentiment of moving onwards and into brighter times.
Mm. And even taking it maybe a level deeper a little bit, Eve, is how did you feel when you did that tour?
Mm.
What were the sentiments and emotions that you were experiencing when you were just going through that tour and seeing those things, and how did you feel?
Hmm. I'm trying to take myself back. What I would describe it as is, I think curiosity is one that came up. Like I was very curious and wanting to learn in a really respectful manner. Um, I think that's like the big thing that came up because it's just so different than the reality, of course, in Canada, at least like I should say the part of Canada in which I live in. And um, I think yeah, it was a curiosity and yeah, sort of just like obviously like seeking to know and understand, but also acknowledging that it's an extremely different like reality than the one that I'm used to. And it was I was with my co-founder Liv, but also two of our friends who actually lived with on exchange, and they were from Bogota. So for them, they come from like an urban, they come specifically from more a safer region, and coming to Comuna Tres all together was, I think we had that shared experience, actually, all of us. So both, you could say Colombian natives and Liv and I, so, a group of half and half, really equally sharing that sort of curiosity and seek for learning.
That's amazing. And I guess Eve, before I wanted to teleport us to Africa, to East Africa and Kenya,
Mhm.
I wanted to ask one more thing actually. I'm curious about
Yes.
because you mentioned about, you working remote there, and obviously you were, building a business at that time remote there. So what advice would you or tips you would give to people who are looking to work remote or build a business remote, and looking to do that in a different location that's outside of their primary, country that they reside in? What should they look for? Is it WeWorks? Is it
Mhm.
the right Airbnbs, the right locations? Like, what are the things they would typically look for to make it a really great experience to also connect with other potential founders or digital nomads or people working remote?
Great question. I think first and foremost, know how you work best, regardless of digital nomading. So in my instance, and this also relates to like your type of work is, I like to be in my own calm setup. I like a closed space. I also have some, for work, like confidential calls. So I am mindful of, I can't take them necessarily in coffee shops. When I'm at home, I've been meeting like when I'm, yeah, in Oakville slash Toronto, like I am largely enjoying like at my space at home and not necessarily taking like coffee talk calls or this sort of thing. Anyways, all to say, I know how I like to work in an ideal state. And so if you can mimic that in another area, as you digital nomad, that'll give you a sense of stability. So in my instance, it was, making sure, yes, that the Wi-Fi in an Airbnb would be good and making sure that I'd have a good desk, that I'd have a fine setup, bringing along, um, Liv got me this actually amazing Moft type of attachment for my laptop so that it's like almost this like mobile stand, that like mobile lift, if you will. And it's not too heavy. And so it just makes my setup more ergonomic. So it's these little things of knowing already how you like to work and seeing how you can recreate that for yourself. That's number one. I think second, well, Wi-Fi is like extremely important. Speed of internet. Make sure you're checking that. Get recommendations, whether it's on Spaces or, are there outages in this community or whatnot? A lot of, for example, coastal towns may go down. Like I've been, you kind of know from one region to the next based on research. So definitely do that because you don't want to be extra stressed having calls dropped, this, that, the other. And then lastly, um, definitely some things that you can look if you're looking to connect with other founders. I find whether it's WhatsApp groups or Facebook groups, even Eventbrite, ahead of time, if you're specifically looking to connect with founders, get onto those, whether it's chats or forums, so that you can know what you're going into. Another thing is even researching. There's certain hubs that are greater for others. When I'm trying to think of examples, but I think in Colombia, there's a lot of, or actually, I know familiar in like Costa Rica, there's a lot of digital nomads in like the well tech space. A lot of folks also doing graphic design and the sort of thing. In Colombia, we met honestly quite the range, I would say. But I think depending on where you go, you will find that it may attract a certain type of digital nomad over another. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, there's obviously a lot of popular places like a Bali, like a Medellin, even places in Costa
Mm.
Rica, right? Like many different pockets. And as you see, as you said, right, it potentially attracts different kinds of digital nomads with different kinds of people that go there and work remote from there. And if you fit within, the right group that you feel that you connect to, and it's miraculous, and you're all building something really special together. That's very different as well, right? So.
Totally. And maybe even just to add on to that, you know, you can look into what kind of hostels are available. And some of them, are actually even designed to be more for digital nomads. And so going, like doing the research, seeing how long maybe are people staying, what's the vibe, this sort of thing is also good in terms of like choosing maybe where you want to land first when if you want to be more in community, and then moving maybe into your own Airbnb. That's actually what Liv and I did. It was a really good choice to like get connected to a more formal digital nomad space, like the magnet of like Selena's, for example, and then choosing how we want to live onwards and based on the lifestyle that we're seeing and we're choosing.
That's awesome. Well, Eve and the audience, those who are listening, we're gonna teleport us all the way to East Africa, to Kenya, and I'm very very excited for this for this story because you've experienced both the city but also Masai Mara as well. So, but first of all, tell us, how did you end up in Kenya? Were you doing a trip around Africa? Did you go there specifically? How did that story come about?
It was a very lucky thing, and I'm very grateful that I actually got a scholarship to go on a uh, a volunteer service trip to the Masai Mara. So it was one of these things. I had gotten this actually at the very end of high school. I was awarded it, but it was in my after the first year of uni that I got to go. And so the trip to the Masai Mara was about 3 weeks, and of course that's like the rural region, where we were doing service work, doing a lot of learning, doing a lot of understanding of social impact, so on and so forth. But I extended my trip spontaneously because I remembered that my yoga studio was connected to a yoga studio in Oakville in Canada. Power Yoga Canada was connected to one in Kenya, in Nairobi specifically. And so because I, done my youth teacher training, because I was immersed, I thought, oh, it'd be so amazing to spend some time in Nairobi, part of, the yoga scene, understanding the industry, getting connected to that specific studio called Africa Yoga Project at the time. And they have a number of outreach programs as well. Um, and so anyway, long story short, I went from being in the rural region to being in a very urban region.
Very interesting. Well, then let's dive a bit deeper into both of these because I'm very interested in hearing, your experiences and your perspective on both of these. So let's start with the Masai Mara. It is, a lot of people a dream destination to go to, right? And just, where did you live? And what was the day to day for I think the 3 weeks you said that you were there. So what was that experience like?
It was incredible, obviously. So we stayed in a camp, and I would call it glamping because we had these very nice, if you, how to put it, they were tents with bunk beds, but we had some running water. It wasn't always hot, but it was for the area quite quite luxurious. And it was a camp where it was accommodating the folks who were on the volunteer service trip. Essentially, we would split the days in half. So we'd have half the day of learning, whether it was, actively visiting some of the sites, understanding the pillars of water projects, of health projects, of agriculture projects. And then the other half would be spent contributing to rebuilding the foundations of a school. So whether that was mixing cement, laying it down, this sort of thing. And really, it would alternate. But we got such a holistic view of the development projects happening in the region and getting to connect to the locals who were, working on the projects, who would teach us about it, when we were coming on site, and then also the guides who were also, taking care of us at the camp and such. So I would say that was like the majority of like the work, but then we also had excursions within that. Actually, I should say only a couple because we were really there. We were quite immersed on that camp and in around the projects. We did get to do a safari, which I have to say is one of the most incredible experiences of my life. It felt like I was in a video game. And I say that because the sort of movement of different species of the landscapes, of the changing sky, like it just felt like I was in the simulation. It felt so surreal and it felt so sublime. Yeah, I'd never seen, I guess, such a natural and rich representation of nature and the ecosystem working in the way that it's meant to. And so I say this from, seeing just the diversity of animals all cohabitating, but of course they're also, predators, prey, this all this sort of thing. Seeing how untouched it is by humans and a lot of what we see in urban regions, the sort of destruction that can happen to ecosystems due to human footprint. So it was yeah, the most incredible experience.
There's definitely a purity to that. When I was in South Africa, I went to the safari, and it's very hard to describe without experiencing it. And I remember when I was on that entire day at the safari, and it's just completely free, right? The animals are roaming around. You see them living their
Yes.
day-to-day life, basically. And sometimes I remember one chilling moment I got was when the sun was setting, and you kind of see that sun slowly coming down, and you see the shadows of the trees. And I saw a giraffe going
Mhm.
there, walking by the tree, and it was just such a uh, the emotions you experience. I think at that moment, it's very hard to describe, but it's maybe purity is the right word. Um, you
Yeah.
know, what
I
what
also think that purity, and I also think that there's something humbling about it from feeling like, oh, I am just this human with my group and, in a van, and there's just this like vastness of landscape, of nature, of like just even the vastness, like look at this like sky, this horizon, but then also, in the next instant, you're you're meters away from a lion or, lions plural. And okay, you're safe in the van. However, you realize you realize how dangerous the nature can also be in terms of, what you mean in this context. And so I think there's definitely there's a humility there too.
Yeah, a great point. And I guess from perspective of the local people that's living there, were you able to interact with them? What was their day-to-day life like? How are the people that were living in that region that you were in?
Hmm. It varies quite a bit. So, on one hand, there's the folks who are working on the camp, are English speaking guides. But also, in the area, there was the teachers that are employed by the government. There's the I should say the jewelry makers who work with beads day in, day out. That was like one of the core um, economics types, or I should say, economic development type projects there. So there's, you see folks living there day to day in whatever, professions, jobs they've got, and, raising families, everything, around the world that's the same. But then on the flip side, you also see a different type of life, um, tiny communities in the middle of, for example, the Masai Mara, who are living, very simple lives and maybe, more connected to, how to put it, I guess connected to, like we mentioned, the ecosystem, but also kind of on the timeline of the day of the rise of the sun, the fall of the sun. Folks, and it's a stereotype, but like, walking very far distances in order to make it to wherever they're trying to go to, whether it's a school or otherwise. So you do see, folks also, as you see in many of the pictures, like they are carrying jugs of water on their heads. That's a method to transport water from wells or whether it's rivers or whatnot to their homes. Like you do see this as well. And so there's quite the range. I think that I studied international development and globalization in my undergrad, and it was quite uh, surreal for me, like a year of studying a lot of this, and then actually seeing this region was also eye-opening, and yeah, taking like textbook to real life, but also, going in with a critical perspective as well. And I think it's really healthy to exercise that always.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something beautiful in a simple, slower life, especially in a world where there's a lot of distractions or a lot of fast pace in certain like metropolitan cities, right? And so even bringing that to Nairobi, right? You're going from a more slower paced life to then going now to Nairobi, which
Mhm.
is a massive city. There's a lot of people, probably a lot of honking, a lot of noise.
Mhm. Yeah.
So what is the one key takeaway that you would say you took away from transitioning from that to Nairobi and your experience in Nairobi?
Yeah, from seeing all the stars in the sky because there's no light pollution and there's just this beautiful silence with only the sounds of the animals and like for example in the evenings too, the hustling and bustling of Nairobi, like that was definitely quite the transition. It's funny, like, you're going through the streets and there's like, there's not necessarily lanes. Are we really following the traffic signs? Not really. So quite different. And I think it definitely took an adjustment, but I think, and this is another thing we can talk about, but like there was actually a lot more of a shock, I think, coming back to Canada after having, the Masai Mara, then Nairobi, and then coming back. It's, quite a lot to keep up with emotionally, psychologically, all that.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think even it goes back to, part of what you were mentioning in terms of, people having in some ways like a simpler life, I think, and seeing so many different types of lifestyles and realities for folks and, some chosen, but also, to acknowledge some which are involuntary, right? Like it's just what the lives that people are living. I think coming back, it was interesting. It was like a lot more material. You realize right away, like the sort of how material things are. Um, I would think I was a little bit disturbed by how some of what it felt very superficial coming back home after seeing like very different realities in Kenya. But that being said, like this is also our reality, and we would say like the global north, and living in Canada, and specifically Oakville/Toronto.
Yeah, these are just really great reflections. And the last stop we'll make on this journey in this podcast episode will be in Iceland, where
Yeah.
you stop there for a single day. Is that correct? Just a one
Yeah,
day
that's
layover.
right.
So this
Yeah.
could be a great experience for those who do have a 1 day layover and to what they would do to be able to maximize that time. So, you know, what did you do in Iceland for that 1 day?
So firstly, we were breathing some super fresh air. It was so crisp, felt so fresh. What did we do? We landed in the morning, and this is okay. This was myself and my two brothers. We were traveling onwards to Poland, where our family is, and this just happened to be a cheap flight. And we're like, oh, we'll make a day out of it. And we landed in the morning. We had some traditional like Icelandic pastries and the airport, and then we rented a car. We drove to Reykjavik, and we went around the harbor front. Then we went to the Sky Lagoon. We went to have hot dogs. We had, which are like a staple there. We also had seafood soup. We had a bunch of we had Icelandic water, of course. And so, yeah, we had a little bit of a food moment before driving back to the airport and seeing the sunset late night. I think it was, 10 p.m. and the sun was just setting, something like that. So it was a really neat experience of great food, walking around harbor front and seeing, the landscape of from the volcanic scene to the waters, and then going to Sky Lagoon. And I can tell you all about Sky Lagoon. It was very cool as well to have this spa, like, and honestly have a half spa day, if you will, on our layover.
So Sky Lagoon is a spa place.
Yeah, so Blue Lagoon is the one that's probably more popular. That's the, misty one that everyone takes photos of. It's super Instagram famous. And Sky Lagoon is, I believe it's a newer one, but essentially it's natural in that there's I don't know how to call it, but I guess like the warm waters. And then what you do is you do a sort of seven-step ritual through there's dry sauna, then there's everything from the steam to the scrubs to um, the mist, and then the ice plunge as well. And so it was a really neat experience to be first, like in the Sky Lagoon itself is, these formations of rocks, and we're gravitating. It feels like you're going through caves, except for like they're open on the top. Um, and we navigated through that, and you kind of put yourself on the ledge with your whole body immersed in this warm water, and you look out over the water into, yeah, you're going from one natural kind of water to seeing another type of natural water, and then getting to do this really neat cycle, the spa cycle, using like the sort of products and ingredients that are really naturally sourced. So it was very cool, very calming. And oh, on top of it, I have to say, there was this essentially this bar that is within one of the caves, if you will, and they serve wine, sparkling wine, beer, everything you want, and you're just walking around with a lovely glass and chatting about life. It was really nice in a relaxed way.
Wow. Well, that's a fantastic picture to kind of
Yeah.
end it on, and no, that's fantastic. And Eve, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast and sharing your amazing experiences, and really appreciate the time. And I hope to have you back on next time as well.
Thanks so much. For sure. More traveling and we'll share more. Cheers.
Absolutely. Cheers.